Mother's Day was just a few weeks ago. What do you guys think of Mother's Day? Like it? It's good? Okay, a little ambivalence. I like it. I like it. I've had a mother for over 4 decades. She's a great person. I love her. I've been a mother myself for a decade, and that's a wonderful experience as well. So in general, I like Mother's Day. But when I tend to open up magazine articles or newspapers around Mother's Day, I get very disappointed by the types of articles that I'm reading. Debates about women in work and between stay-at-home moms and working moms, and all of it drives me crazy. There's a lot of articles encouraging women to opt out or to have it all, or as one New York Magazine feature put it, to reclaim the domesticity of our grandmothers. And all of this leaves me rather uninspired. I find a lot of these articles problematic for 2 reasons. One is that they don't take economic circumstances seriously enough. The article about reclaiming grandmotherly domesticity spends a lot of time talking about retro housewives and the work that they're doing raising children, and talking about when their kids are at school, they get to go to craft classes and things like that. And they only kind of slightly in the background mention the 6-figure salary of the husband that enables all of this to take place. And that's not, I'm not condemning this at all, but I feel like the economic circumstances are so important that need to be out there in the front. And also, sometimes you read articles that really, they focus on an article of stay-at-home moms on the Upper East Side, the most expensive, zip code in the country. And they're funny, right? You read these, but they're stereotypes, and they're not very helpful because none of these really look at the kind of economic reckoning that most families go through when they determine how many people they're sending into the workforce, which is very serious work. The other problem I have with a lot of these articles is they tend to distort history. In that article about retro housewives, there is a quote too. The retro housewives, quote, mine their grandmother's old-fashioned lives for values they can appropriate like heirlooms, then proudly wear as their own. So what if your grandmother was not a housewife? Or what if your grandmother was a housewife but didn't like being a housewife? And although I think we all can agree that learning a craft is a great thing, there's a world of difference between taking a craft class on crocheting, or between a grandmother that was working in a garment factory sewing piecework. So all of this is very, very different, and the economic circumstances get lost often. Because the domesticity described in some of these articles were as far out of reach for many grandmothers as they are for today's granddaughters. Whether they're staying at home or whether they're working, it's hard to find the time, let alone the money, to craft. But I'm lucky because, ironically, when I go to work, my anxiety over these articles abates, which seems kind of weird. If you're going to work, why does that happen? But where I work at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, I can go to work and I can confront history, because at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, we've recreated the apartments of immigrant families from Ireland, from Germany, from Italy, from Eastern Europe, all of whom lived in the building, and we curate their real stories. And often their real stories put us into very thorny, complicated situations, and we get to see how these women responded and how they worked. Whether they earned wages or they didn't earn wages, they were doing work, and that work was essential to their households and to their families. And their work shows just an impassioned participation in their family's economic survival. And so these tenement households from the 1860s to the 1930s provide more inspiration for me than the static images I read about in some of these magazine articles. And precisely because these lives, the lives of these women, complicate strict dichotomies between stay-at-home moms and working moms, they move us beyond mommy wars, and they put us into a deeper, richer, and ultimately more useful exploration of family life, women's work, and shifting economic realities. So here's the tenement from the outside, 97 Orchard on the Lower East Side. And this is the hallway, so we're going to go right inside. And I'm going to talk about one of the first families that lived in the building, one of the first families that we depict, which is an Irish family. And the Moores lived in this building in the late 1860s. Bridget Moore had 3 children under the age of 4. And the reason I chose the hallway to tell her story is that I often think about her living on an upper floor, having to go up and down staircases to get running water. If you think in your daily lives how often you use water when you go to the faucet, right? You use water to brush your teeth, to have tea, to have coffee, to do dishes, to do laundry. Every time, imagine that every time you needed to use water, you're going to be going outside and carrying a pail of water. And then imagine that you're bringing your children with you as you do this and carrying a baby as you do it as well. And then now imagine in that hallway is very dark. It's not in the picture because electricity has been added since the 1860s. But when Bridget Moore would have been going down that hallway, it would have been extremely dark. There was no light. And she would have been passing other women also carrying their buckets of water. So domestic life was not about crafting, right? Domestic life was hard labor. And I think too about Bridget, she wasn't just, this is great, here I am with my bucket. She might have been thinking about her life before she got married. She arrived in New York in 1863 as a single 17-year-old, and we surmise that she probably worked as a domestic servant. Most Irish women worked as domestic servant in the 1860s, and of the domestic servants in New York, 80% were Irish. So there's a really good chance that Bridget Meehan was working as a domestic servant, and that was hard work. I'm not going to pretend it was a nice, you're sitting down and reading the newspaper. What she was doing was grueling work. However, the advantages to this domestic work was that she's probably living uptown in a nicer home, a middle-class home. She doesn't have to pay rent to be there. So even though she's not earning a ton of money, she's earning some money. And we know from historical records that a lot of these Irish women were able to send remittances home to Ireland. So they had a kind of economic independence. And because of that, and also because there were so many Irish women who were part of that migration, a lot of women didn't marry right away. They tended to marry later in life, and some Irish women didn't marry at all. And I wonder if Bridget, on some days carrying those children, carrying that bucket, was thinking about maybe her friend Mary Kate, who was still working as a domestic servant, who would maybe come visit her on Sunday afternoons, and maybe Bridget was wondering, maybe that was another path she might have taken. So these lives were not static, these lives were complicated. And the hallway wasn't static either. Over time, the hallway changed. Gas light was introduced. Running water was introduced. Toilets were introduced to the building, not because of the landlord's benevolence, but because a law that came about because of progressive activists mandated that these amenities be added to the building. So one of the later residents we talk about, an Italian woman, Rosaria Baldizzi, she had 2 small children, and so she has electricity by the time she's there. She has the running water, but make no mistake, her domestic life was tedious. She was always cleaning. She was scouring linoleum. She's living in a 325 square foot apartment. Her life becomes even more complicated during the Depression when her husband loses his carpentry job, and she then has to go into the labor force, even as she's doing the dishes and doing everything else, and she sews coats. So the background of domestic work never goes away. It's always grueling, but often women enter and are earning money themselves and responding to economic situations. And indeed, I think the most fascinating thing to do is to look at these stories and think about how women responded to shifting economic circumstances. This is the kitchen of Natalie and Julius Gumpertz, and this is a family that lived there in the 1870s. He was a shoemaker. By 1874, they had 4 children. One day, Julius goes to work in October of 1874, and he does not return. This was in the wake of a great panic, a Great Depression of 1873, and a lot of New Yorkers were unemployed, 25%, and those even who were employed dealt with reduced wages, and a lot of men with families deserted their families. They went west. And although they might have paid for the price of that ticket, that price of that liberating train ride for them was really paid for by the wives who were left behind with the children. And Natalie Gumpertz probably didn't have a lot of time to sit there and think about whether she missed Julius or whether she was happy she was gone. She just knew that cash wasn't coming in that allowed her to take care of that kitchen. And what she did was she opened up a dressmaking business. So she was a woman who was able to work at home and still raise her children. She was someone who had to respond to the circumstances that came about and had to respond to them in an economic manner. And this is her parlor where she set up a dressmaking business. And this is her. Downstairs from Natalie was a lager beer saloon. run by John Schneider. If you look at the historical records, you just see the name John Schneider. But we know that helping John Schneider was his wife, Caroline Schneider, because one of the benefits of going to this saloon as opposed to the other 700 saloons in the neighborhood, not exaggerating, was the food that they offered. And most likely that was his wife preparing all of that food. And that food was not just a supplement, that food was kind of essential to bringing people in. And she wasn't just making the food and shopping for the food, she was using her business acumen to kind of figure out, oh, that guy's from Wartenberg, I like him. I'm gonna make the pretzels that resemble the pretzels from Wartenberg. That guy's from Bavaria, I don't like him, no Bavarian food. But she's gonna be she's going to be cultivating clientele through her food, and her work was absolutely essential to the functioning of the saloon. It was open for over 20 years, and I don't think it's a kind of a quirk or coincidence that a year after she dies, within a year after her death, in the 1880s, John Schneider closes his saloon there. So women were working. Their home, by the way, was there. That was their home. That was the front saloon. There was a back room behind it. There was a kitchen where she would be preparing the food. And behind the kitchen was probably the one room that was private that she shared with her husband. And they had a son as well. In the 1890s and 1900s, the German immigrants had moved uptown, and the new wave of immigrants were East European Jews. This is the apartment, the 325 square foot apartment of Harris and Jenny Levine. Many of the East European Jews worked in the garment industry, so their tenement, where they raised 5 children, was also a place where 3 additional workers came in and helped produce the dresses and make the dresses. And I always think, and a lot of the educators kind of imagine Jenny in there doing this housework. Again, this is before running water is there. She has to share her oven with a presser who's going to be warming up the coals for his iron there. And she has to use that stove too to do everything, to boil the water, to clean the diapers, to do everything. I always think of her, in the drudgery of the housework, looking at that pink dress, knowing that that dress that dominates her home is not something she's going to be able to wear. In 1900, when the Levines were still there, this is Levine children, in 1900, there were 20 households, and 10 of them had boarders. So what that meant is that people in their 325 square foot apartments, they couldn't afford to pay the rent just based on one person's salary. The women couldn't go out to work often, the mothers, because they were doing all that housework. So what they did is they rented parts of their apartment to boarders, single men or single women who would pay a few dollars a week. They would provide a mattress for them, and the landlady might cook for them. But in essence, these immigrant women who have maybe been in America 1 month, 6 months, 12 months, 5 years maybe, they're supplementing and in some cases driving the income of the entire family by acting as landladies of these small apartments that they've rented. So business acumen is absolutely important for the work that they're doing. Religious work was also led by women. Historians tend to kind of think about religious sources as sermons written by men often, when thinking about the 19th century, the 18th century. But when you look at the tenements, you're reminded of how religious work was housework. The biggest holiday to hit the East European Jews was the Sabbath, which came every week. And the Sabbath requires having beautiful clothing, nice food, clean homes. It requires shopping to make the meal. None of that falls from the heavens in time for the Friday night sunset. And so Fridays, women are out swarming the markets, doing the shopping. Even the tenement facades would be transformed because they'd be hanging their mattresses out to air and their sheets. And so the whole tenements were kind of blanketed in the linen that these women were doing. And that's what brought the Sabbath into the tenement apartments, the women's work. At the same time, in 1900, there was a family called the Lustgartens that lived in the lower floor of 97 Orchard. This is a picture of them from the late 1880s, actually, and they were a family of Israel Lustgarten, who's at the right of the picture. Israel Lustgarten was a butcher, a kosher butcher, and the rest of the family were butchers too. You can see that they're all wearing aprons, showing how important. Even the 5-year-old little boy, William, was wearing an apron. So family work was often just that, family work, and it took the whole family to kind of get a business going. In 1902, the price of kosher meat goes up from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. It's a huge jump for people. And in many ways, this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in the sense that people were already taking care of their households, and this just made it impossible to buy meat. And you might think, oh, why don't they get eggs? Why don't they get chickens? Well, everyone else raised their prices because the other prices went up. And so these housewives boycotted the stores. They used the same networks that helped them find borders, and they spread the word, don't buy meat, don't buy meat, don't buy meat, meet at this hall. They gave fiery speeches in Yiddish. They organized politically. And this is from the New York Sun, listening to a boycott appeal. Women gathered on the streets, and this spread, not just on the Lower East Side, but other Jewish immigrant neighborhoods where there were kosher meat. And it was a really amazing feat. And the New York Times wrote about it. The Yiddish newspapers wrote about it. The Yiddish papers championed the might of the women. However, the American newspapers, I just want to get there, they talked about how riotous and uncivilized these women were, because in some cases, the protests they had led to physical violence, and in some cases they threw cabbages or onions or even bricks at the storefronts of the retail butchers. And indeed, this is the might of the women in Yiddish, seeing the immigrant women with the kind of the key to the meat trust. And this is the Lustgarten's butcher shop. So that nice family of apron-clad butchers, their store at 97 Orchard was attacked on May 16th, 1902, by immigrant women who were upset about the rise in the price. It's not really the fault of the retail butchers. They were just following what the wholesalers had done, and they had tried to protest it, but the immigrant women didn't know all that. And they were, again, they were just livid. And I often think about what it would be like as we have visitors stand in the Lustgarten store, in the space that was their store. What would it have felt like to be the Lustgartens and have that brick come through the window and have your business interrupted, and to have that kind of fear of a mob outside? What was going on? And I think, though, that even in that situation, as horrible as it might have been, I think Goldie Lustgarten, the mother, would have understood the plight of those rioters, because after all, she was just like them. She was a mother, she was raising children, she had boarders, she was in charge of the family's kind of economic accounting. She'd be collecting wages that her older children were making. She had to make sure that the wages worked. That was the kind of role of the immigrant woman in the household. And she probably understood that it got to a point where they couldn't do anything. And women on either side of those lines had a huge pride in their role of accountants, as accountants, and their business acumen. And in many ways, I think this riot brings into relief a pride they had on a daily basis. So these are just some quotes from newspapers that show the ways in which they were defending their role as managers of the household funds. One woman said, "Our husbands work hard. They try their best to bring a few cents into the house. We must manage to spend as little as possible. We will not give away our last few cents to the butcher and let our children go barefoot." Another one, "My husband brings me $8 a week. Should I give it away to the butcher? What would the landlord say?" And especially instructive in this regard is the depiction of a New York Tribune towards the end of the boycott. I will say that the price did go down due to all those efforts, and it went back down to 14 cents. And towards the end of this, they profiled a woman named Sarah Cohen, who had opened up a kind of a cooperative butcher store. And what they wrote was, "It has been a women's strike throughout, and its efficiency shows what power lies in the hands of the administrator of the family funds." The reporter also noted Sarah Cohen's astute business sense and her observations on America. And so this is them quoting Sarah Cohen. "There should be no food trust in America. How can America be the land of the people if the trusts can tax food when they please?" And not only did they, herald her observations of America, they said other American-born women should be more like her. So this is Goldie Lustgarten's granddaughter. Her name was Blossom Sachs, and this is a picture from 1954 from the New York Times, and she is being sworn in as the executive manager of the Manhattan Borough President Hewlin Jack. And he was actually, at that point, he was the African-American who had held the highest position in New York, and she was joining him to help in his administration. She was a lawyer. She was also noted in this article that she was active as well in parent-teacher association, so she was a working mom. But I think a lot about her, and I think about her as the granddaughter of Goldie Lustgarten. Goldie Lustgarten worked alongside her husband in a butcher shop, and she, in that decade, along with these other immigrant women, were starting to understand their power as consumers and their political power. 2 generations later, Blossom Sachs understands her role as an American woman as someone who can become an attorney and can push the boundaries of a lot of the expectations that are there. It teaches us that in each generation, women should take what they have and they should think creatively and practically about creating new positions. So when Mother's Day rolls around, it rolls around in May, of course, if I can't seek inspiration from the newspaper articles and the magazines depicting other stay-at-home moms or working moms or whatever it is they're depicting, I do find inspiration from the Kosher Meat Boycott. It reminds me of the generations of immigrant women, and I don't even like meat that much. It reminds me of the generations of immigrant women who grasped the complexity of their world and worked hard to create something better for their children. Sparring between working moms and stay-at-home moms or indulging in grass is greener scenarios about the comforts and perks of the others wastes time and energy. Whether we work or we stay at home, we need to exercise our political and consumer power to fight for justice in the workplace, to ensure equal pay and flexible work hours, so that men and women can go about the ever-shifting and perhaps eternally complex struggle to balance career and family, and to leave a better world for the next generation.